Promotional support for the Creative Nonfiction Podcast is provided by Hippocampus Magazine. Now in its 5th year, Hippocampus publishes creative nonfiction essays and just completed its 3rd annual conference, Hippocamp, in lovely Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Be sure to check out the website, hippocampusmagazine.com, for submission guidelines, but also to read the wonderful work being done there. Hippocampus Magazine, memorable creative nonfiction. Feel good? Let's do the show. Hey, CNFers. I'm Brendan O'Mara, and this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to the world's best artists about creating works of nonfiction. Leaders in the world of narrative journalism, memoir, essay, radio, and documentary film, to tease out tactics and routines to inspire you and the work you're doing. I love it, baby. Today we've got Matthew Mercier for episode 69, who wrote a great essay in creative nonfiction about HIP, H-I-P, high-intensity practice, and we dig into that a lot. We also talk a great deal about the power of spoken word performances, as he has performed stories for the Moth. There's a lot of great stuff that we unpack, so I hope you'll hang with us. Hey, and the reviews and ratings, they keep coming in, and I just want to extend a heartfelt thank you. Please keep them coming. I've been leaving more and more on the podcasts I love, even ones that, quote-unquote, don't need the reviews, because you can't ask for them if you're not willing to dole them out, too. What kind of monster do you think I am? In any case, please share this episode with a friend. Leave a review. If you've got 60 seconds, that's really all it takes. And head over to BrendanO'Mara.com for a toe tap and good time. There's a monthly newsletter there that doles out my monthly book recommendations and what you might have missed in the podcast. No spam, I promise. Damn. You're like, shut the cuss up, Brendan, and bring on the guest already. Well, here you go. Here's Matthew Mercier. Thank you. Given that it's, fairly early in the morning, I wonder how you start your mornings. And I love morning routines, and I wonder how you started today and how you start most days.
I usually feed my cats first. They're pretty demanding. Yes, honestly, they're exacting. They jump on the bed, and they're up early too, so they're like my alarm clock. So I get up, feed them. Go through the routine of housekeeping if there's little things to do. But as soon as I can, I either get out to an office, a shared office that I have with my wife, or if she's going out for the day, I'll just plug up the windows, put my earphones in, lock out the internet, and get to work at home. So that's as soon as I can get to my work. But housekeeping comes first. All the little routines, those kind of ground me.
Yeah,
before I get.
Yeah, they can be like it's like an easy win in the morning to kind of build a little momentum, right? Like making your bed or something as silly as that. It just kind of helps snowball some good momentum that I'm sure you can parlay into your work at that point.
It is, and sometimes, and although some mornings there is the New York phenomena of having to do opposite side of the street parking, which I'm not sure. Are you familiar with this? Have you know about this?
I lived in Washington, D.C. before, and we've had to do very similar things. Yeah.
Very annoying. But it's, it's the luxury of having a car. Parking it is just expensive. So some mornings, but that's when I get to read. I get to read, and I get to meet my neighbors, see my neighbors, which is how New Yorkers on the block, we commiserate. So during opposite side of the street parking. So yeah, every morning's a little different. In the future, however, my wife and I we are hightailing it out of the city. So hopefully we're going to be living upstate in the future. So hopefully my routine will be a little less city driven and more bucolic.
Yeah.
We're going to be living in the country, thank goodness. So yeah.
Yeah, are you thinking like Hudson County or somewhere farther north of that?
Columbia County, which is like 2 hours north of the city, so it's not too far. But my wife's work is rooted in the city, so we didn't want to go too far. But it's perfect. We found a really nice community, and I've been in the city for a while, and I it's time to leave for work purposes and everything. It's just.
Yeah. So what does the nature of your work look like? Is it more education teacher based, or is it more grounded in the writing?
Well, for a long time, I was teaching at Hunter College, where I went to school. I got an MFA at Hunter, so they hired me afterwards to teach there, and that was my routine. I was working as a teacher part time, but writing has always been. I've always been selfish about my writing, as I'm sure you know. You have to be. You have to just put it up front and center. So I've always made time for the writing as much as the teaching. I mean, the teaching was always a part of it, and I had a great time at Hunter College. And then when I switched over to Avenues, that was a bit more demanding, just because it was a new format, it was a new schedule. In the back of my mind, I always say, where can I fit in the writing time? That's always the first question, and then I work everything around that. Yeah,
it's always a matter of the time is there. It's just a matter if you can prioritize it right, and then that's always the challenge. But if it's really important, you do find the time, and you shoehorn that writing time, even if it's like Andre Dubus saying, like the 17 minutes I was able to get in my truck and drive to the side of this graveyard, and I had 17 minutes, and that was my writing time. Little kids, carpentry business, and that's how he wrote House of Sand and Fog in 17-minute chunks, essentially. So, I
saw the blurb on your podcast for your interview with him, and I thought that's how he did it. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
He's written religiously pretty much every day, 6 to 7 days a week for 30 years, and a longhand and notebooks with a pencil. And in the early days, he just did it because it was that itch. He had to do it. And he would take it in whatever form it could. And in that instance, he was just writing it in the driver's side seat, right on the steering wheel, basically. And little by little, it added up to what ended up being his breakout novel.
The House of Sand and Fog, was that the one he was writing? Was that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's incredible to hear. But that's how you do it. It's a little bit every day with faith and hope, and you just move forward. I was listening to an interview with Jess Walter, a great novelist from Spokane, Washington. And he said, you can't get into this business unless you're ready to accept it. It's a glacial pace.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you just accept it, it's a glacial pace. Yeah.
And that's the real trouble. I like asking people how they cultivate their own sense of patience with it, because a lot of times you can look, if you take off blinders and look at other people's train tracks, and you start seeing people that might be, your peers, and they appear to be ahead of you, or geez, God forbid, someone's 5 or 10 years younger than you and they're ahead of you career-wise, and you just start pulling your hair out. And
right.
And you make those comparisons. Like it can be hard to be patient and not have those ugly feelings of jealousy creep in sometimes. And how have you dealt with that in your career as a writer and teacher? Trying to run your own race, but naturally your eyes will tend to drift a bit.
Yeah. It's funny. Students were asking me this last semester. They were wondering, and I said, well, first rule is that you stay off the internet as much as possible. And I wasn't kidding.
Yeah.
Stay off the internet, social media, use it sparingly, because jealousy is I let jealousy in a little bit. I acknowledge the feeling, and then I just let it go. I used to have a punching bag. I used that, that I would use. But I really try to acknowledge jealousy, but I stay off the internet. I do other things. If I feel jealousy creeping in, I'll just remind myself also that there are things in my life that people are jealous of. They look at me and they look at a few things. And I've been very surprised, because you don't often think that you would be an object for jealousy, but people get jealous about everything, and especially in New York City.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's different out there, but it's I suspect not. But staying off the internet and not following people that you're jealous of, Yeah, and really, it's a corrosive feeling. I have to you just remind yourself that it's, success for one person is success for all of us, especially in the age where print media is, subservient to television or other mediums. The fact that anyone's publishing a book and that any book is successful should be cause for celebration. So that you try and just get really zen and pick up the newspaper and just give yourself a reality check. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah. And I suspect that some people, if they looked at your highlight reel and saw that you were on, you had 2 appearances on the Moth, and that's like, wow, that's a huge thing, and which I think is which was really, really great, especially just the fact that you were able to parlay such a cool story on the Moth, and I will definitely link that up in the show notes, and we'll get into that right now. This question deals directly with it. How did you end up in Edgar Allan Poe's basement in a Bronx house?
How did I end up there? That's a bit of a story. So it was 2001. I had just moved back to the city, and I was trying to find. I'd never lived here. Didn't move back. I was born here. I moved to the city, was looking as anyone was looking for a job, looking for a living situation. And then through a series of unfortunate events, I lost both my jobs. I had a job working for a documentary filmmaker. I had a job working for a nonprofit, and both just disappeared. It was unfortunate. And all of a sudden, and I had an apartment. So all of a sudden I had rent due. I had no work, and it was quite a desperate situation. So I was sitting in Dempsey's Pub on the Bowery in 2001. And the Bowery was just starting to gentrify, but it was still the Bowery of New York old. Like, it was still run down and fit my mood perfectly. And I just was sitting with some friends who were living at a place called the Catholic Worker, which was down the street, which was an old Depression era organization that helped the homeless. And so I was volunteering there and just fishing around for any work, because it was a good place to ask for immediate work. And a friend of mine turned to me and just said, "Oh yeah, I've got a job. If you want free rent for the rest of your life." And I said, "Yeah, of course." And he said, "Well, you have to live in the Bronx." And he told me all about Edgar Allan Poe's house up on the Grand Concourse. And I didn't believe him, because like most people, I associated Poe with Philadelphia and Baltimore. I had no idea that he had a cottage in the Bronx.
Yeah.
And as soon as he said it, I said, "Yes, absolutely. I'm going to hunt this down and interview." And so I just made a daisy chain. I just connected. I found one person who knew somebody else, and I got the current caretaker's phone number, and I contacted him and said I would love to come up and see it. So I was able to and then I got to the president of the Historical Society, which wasn't too hard. So I moved so fast on it that I was able to get an interview almost before they put the ad in the New York Times. So I really got inside information. So that's basically, and then I interviewed for it, but I had to collect 7 references, which I've never had to do for any job. 7 references to ensure my stability, which was almost really funny, but they said they'd had serious problems in the past, which they wouldn't tell me about, but they seem to imply that, when you offer free rent in New York City, it's a big deal. And people will come out in droves and not always be of the healthiest mindset. So they had to ensure that I was a rational person. So that's yeah. I mean, I pursued it aggressively as I have never pursued anything before. That's not true entirely, but I really just went after it, because I said, this is it. This is what I have to do if I want to stay in New York. And plus, how many chances am I ever going to get for this kind of job? But I have to say, though, when I did finally see the house and found out what the job was, I did take pause a little bit. And my friends were like, "Do you really want to live by yourself in the Bronx in New York City? You might pull a Jack Torrance, in The Shining. You might really go nuts. Like, this is," because it was a very, very isolating place. But I love the Bronx. I as soon as I moved in, I just thought, this is a wonderful place. And it really is. The Bronx gets a bad rap, but it is my favorite borough, obviously. So,
what was that experience like when you first walked into the Poe house and you realized, wow, this is going to be my home for the next few years?
it was quite, it was wonderful because it was a huge educational experience, as well as like thinking, wow, I could do this for a job. But just to know that Poe lived there, it just filled a huge gap in my ignorance. I thought I knew a lot about Poe, but I knew nothing. And his time in the Bronx, it was the last 3 years of his life, and his wife died in the cottage. So, but it was, yeah, and the cottage has its own little city park. It's literally called Poe Park, and it's up on the Grand Concourse. And it was amazing because my mother's from the Bronx originally, so it was it's kind of like coming home, like my ancestral stomping grounds. So it kind of felt, it sounds cheesy to say, but it kind of felt like destiny. I'm like, well, this is really, so it was really kind of emotional because she was born nearby. So, and she had all these old friends nearby. So I went to visit them. And when they found out I was living in the Bronx, they were amazed. They were just like, wow, really? Why is he living in the Bronx? Like, because most people would have gone to Brooklyn, where all affordable rents were in 2001. So no longer.
Yeah. So what did you, as you started to become more educated about Edgar Allan Poe, what about his life and maybe his creative life and his writing life did you maybe begin to internalize yourself and maybe apply to your own work?
I tried to put him in, I finally understood his context. Like, to me, he was wholly original. I think I read, like most people, I read the classics when I was in high school, Telltale Heart, The Raven, Annabelle Lee. And I thought that he was he really was the first American horror writer, for lack of a better pigeonhole. That's what but I not only did I read Poe, but I started reading what he must have read, like all these 18th century Gothic novels, like Anne Radcliffe and a lot of The Monk. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Matthew Lewis's book, really wild Gothic European literature, because he was basically aping the style of European Gothic literature. And I had no clue about that class of literature. And so it was really, I was able to put him in his global literary context, which made reading him all the richer, because I finally understood that he wasn't just plucking these stories out of his craw. He reinvented them for the American scene. So that was really, again, I had lots of time to read as a caretaker, so it was wonderful. I had these giant books, those 18th century Gothic novels are not small, so I had lots of time to read, and that was wonderful, like being able to see where he got the House of Usher. The Telltale Heart was also tremendous because I read that over and over, and I always used to joke with people that it was Crime and Punishment in a page and a half, minus the Catholic existentialism in Russian history, because Dostoevsky, he was inspired. I forgot that he predated Dostoevsky, so he got to all of this psychological realism before so many. He was really, so that was wonderful to see that how many people he predated in American literature, like how many, not just the detective story, but just the getting inside the criminal's head and having empathy for that evil criminal. Yeah.
So how important was storytelling to you growing up and then through your adolescence and early 20s? And as someone having seen the Moth stuff and read your essay in creative nonfiction, you get a sense that it's definitely a part of your fiber and your DNA. So like where did that come from? Where did that love come from? And how important was it for you?
I can't quite say if, the thing about the Moth is that what I felt it did was, for me, was reawaken all those old instincts that I, for some reason, had buried. And I'm not alone in that. Like I've talked to, there's a lot of my friends are from the Moth, and they talk about how the act of getting up and talking and telling a story for an audience just kind of reawakens this old drive that a lot of us have. although it is no doubt, it was a skill that we had to cultivate, telling a story live without notes, as they say in the tagline. So it was both an old instinct, but yet a skill that you had to reawaken or reinvent on the spot. You have to tell these stories. Well, you rehearse them beforehand, but it did make me think about, well, what was the role of storytelling in my young life? And I can't say I came. My parents were great storytellers. I mean, they were both. My father more so was they were in the clergy. My father was a priest, Catholic priest, before he left. And so a homily in the middle of a Catholic mass is that's basically the storytelling aspect. You lift the story from your life and you relate it to whatever the readings are for the day. So my father, if anything, had that. He had that gift, or he had that ability to tell a joke more than anyone else in my family. So that was a huge part to realize that, he got up in public and would have to talk a lot, and he was good at public speaking, even though he's a very nervous guy, which I thought was very ironic. But once he got into the story, he was comfortable. And that's exactly how it is for me. I mean, I get nervous when I go up and I speak and I tell a story. I get nervous every time. And a lot of my friends do. But then once you get the story rolling, once the audience reacts and you see they're enjoying it, then after that, it's all vanilla after that. It's wonderful.
What was your preparation and practice looking like when you were, you got greenlit to do that? So how did you start working through it and just practicing to make sure that you were hitting your beats and just doing it in a fluid manner?
You mean for the story slams and just the Moth stories in general?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a kind of oral storytelling that actually I haven't been able to speak to many people about on the podcast. So I'm kind of fascinated about what your process was like. Yeah.
You know what? Because it's such a strict format. It's 5-6 minutes, right? And that when you're on stage, that feels long, but in reality, it's obviously very short. But my wife has been my first and final critic for all the Moth stories, any story that I've told on stage. I mean, because you do have to rehearse it for somebody at some point. And I mean, you can talk to your plants and your cats, but that's not, but you're always the most amusing person when you talk to yourself. So you have to, my wife, if she's around, I'll rehearse it for her if she has the time to listen. And she always gives great notes. And I never write anything down until afterwards. I talk it out first, beat to beat, line to line, because when you write something down, I mean, I think 5 minutes on the page it's a couple pages. It's different when you write. You add more when you write. And the object with a Moth story is you take out, you cannot include every single detail. You have to focus on not just the right detail, but the most visceral detail. Because a live audience is not going to react. It's not going to react to the same things. If you're reading it off the page, it's quite different, enormously different. So you have to give the most visceral, the most physical, the most immediate details, which sometimes when you're writing something on the page, it's a bit more diffuse. Mm. So it's a performance, and I have to remember that it's a performance. And so some Moth storytellers I know that they do write it down before they go up, and I can't imagine doing that. For me, I have to talk it out. Just talk for 5 minutes, and I know I have some stand-up comics friends who are stand-up comics, and they have a similar process where they tell the joke to a small group of people, and they have to rehearse in front of a small group to see how the joke plays, to see how the delivery lands. It's all about the delivery. It's all about the line readings, and not so much what's on the page. So yeah, but my wife has to be given credit for listening to me, and she's given me my best notes, and she's like, change this, tweak that line here, Don't say that. You'll look like an idiot. And she's right, even if sometimes in the moment I don't agree with her, but then I have to call her afterwards and go, "Yep, honey, you were completely right." But,
so to do so when you're preparing for that kind of storytelling, it's always the sort of the oral part first. Like you're not writing it and then trying to translate it for the ear. Like you're always thinking this is spoken and performance, right. And then so does it at any point ever get written down?
It does afterwards.
Yeah.
Sometimes it does. If I really, really love the story, I will write it down verbatim. But you know what? It really changes tremendously. The Moth published a book of stories that had been on the podcast, and it was quite a success. And it's good to see them in print. But it really just changes when you see it on the page. And I don't quite know how to define it, but it is. I prefer hearing and listening to the story because the human voice is so wonderful, and not just that, but the audience reaction. It's twofold, right? You're hearing the storyteller's voice, but then you're hearing how much pleasure the audience is taking in that story. So you lose that obviously when it gets on the page because it becomes a more intimate one-on-one reading experience with someone. But the whole performance aspect is it allows for community. It allows for this enormous crowd to hear the story, and it's quite a high. Rehearsing the story to 5 people is actually terrifying. Mm. Telling the story to 300, 500 people is not as bad. Ironically, I don't know why, but rehearsing it because we have to go through a rehearsal process with the Moth, especially with the main stage. The producers get you together, everyone who's performing, and you rehearse it in front of each other. And that's the hardest because it's only 5 people. And so you have to get a response out of 5 people. Mm. And you have to, and that's a lot harder. When you have a large audience, the odds that someone's laughter will create a ripple effect and that the community effect will take place. But telling a story to 5 people is quite hard, but that's what you have to do. That's what we have to do when you do a main stage story. Mm.
So what are you more attracted to, the spoken storytelling or written? What do you tend to gravitate more towards?
I've thought about this a lot, but it's really, I wondered when I first started performing at the Moth, I wondered, oh, is this something I should pursue? Am I better at this than I am at writing? But for starters, it's rare that a person can make a living at live storytelling right now. It's just as bad as writing. You're not going to make a lot of money. So it's not as if I could build a career. I think Mike Daisy had it going on for a while. He was telling live, but he's a theatrical person. Are you familiar with his work? Have you heard of it?
I'm not. I just scribbled his name down for show notes and also for me to go back and check that out.
Yeah, check him out. He was a performer, and he tells stories like Spalding Gray. You familiar with that name? Have you heard that name before?
Oh, I'm gonna have to say no.
Yeah, no, yeah. It's yeah. I've always loved introducing people to Spalding Gray.
Okay.
Spalding Gray and sat at a desk and performed monologues for years, and he was riveting. And he had tried being a novelist and failed, and then he found the theater and he found oral storytelling, and he was a bit more he was far more compelling what he found. So I wondered if when I started doing the Moth, but I thought, well, they're both, the Moth really saved me from my isolation as a writer. You spend most of your days by yourself. And then to go out and be able to also do this and to perform with a group of people, because you're not just doing it alone. That's one, you're performing your story by yourself, but you meet a lot of weird and interesting people. And so to able to do both helps me with the writing when I go back to my desk. It helps me to know that I can do this, that I am a storyteller. It just obviously writing a novel or writing an essay is a completely different form. But I do, as a consequence of the Moth, I do read my material out loud on the page more than I ever have. I actually perform it as if I'm doing the audiobook, because I just need to know how it sounds. Yeah, and do you do that? I mean,
definitely. In my own isolation, I definitely will read things out loud. Even this, like just to myself, at about this decibel level. Like I'll read it, and if I find myself, it's almost more to see if I'm stumbling over words, not this. And because if I'm stumbling over something, then it's just not going to read as nice and fluid. So it's a way for me to like iron out the wrinkles. But then, then there are some words that just really crackle, and you really want to hear them out loud. But yeah, that's definitely, I definitely do that, or read out loud, and not necessarily with performance in mind, but it's definitely a way to just hear it, and maybe hear it in the way a future reader is going to, and it's definitely a good way of vetting out certain language and usage.
Yeah. You hear the repeated words. You hear where the passive voice isn't really working, or you just hear all the clunks, and it's really quite helpful. So, but I don't know that, in answer to your question, I don't know that I have a preference for either one right now. I mean, performing, I will say that performing a story takes a lot of energy. Even just a 5-10 minute story takes a great deal of energy to do it right. I mean, I have done shows here in the city where I haven't rehearsed as much because the stakes aren't as high, and that's what the shows are for. They're just for working out material. But if you really want to do a story right and really work, just get it, workshop it until it's tight, that takes as much energy as writing an essay. So it's it's a matter of where do I want to put my energy. And right now, like writing a book is probably going to give me more of a career than live storytelling. But that said, again, like there's a few venues here in the city that are looking for stories for Halloween and Christmas, and I always pitch them stories because I need to. I love performing. I love performing a story, so it's something I do need to do. Yeah.
Have you found that being able to get up on stage and perform these stories is a way of sort of almost focus grouping the resonance of a story, so then you can say, oh, I got all these laughs telling this 5-minute story, that's going to give me juice to write about it and do something longer. Like there's validation there. Like, do you find that you can get validation on the stage and that translates to your writing?
It's that's interesting. I don't know. I'm trying to think of if I have translated some stories, or rather expanded some of the stories that I've told into nonfiction pieces. But really, it's performance is all about the audience, and certainly one audience is going to laugh at something that another audience will not laugh, just because of the makeup of the audience. It's very much like reading. Every reader is going to react differently. So, but I have come upon lines or improvised lines in performance that I will then sometimes try to integrate into a story that I'm writing. But primarily, I think the oral stories live on their own as oral stories. And occasionally I'll take snippets or a scene or something from an oral story and put it into a piece of writing, but only if it really seems to work. Because again, they do two different mediums, and they're so radically different that what works on the stage doesn't always work on the page, and vice versa. So it's really fascinating to see what works and what doesn't for both mediums. Yeah.
If you ever find that you're stuck in your writing, do you then think, oh, this is probably a good time for me to take a break from that and maybe do something that's more performance-based, and that does one break you out of one cycle and help stimulate the other?
Yeah, occasionally it does. If I know that I have a performance coming up, it's actually a relief to do that and put aside the writing for a while. And it's also a relief to not make stuff up, like, because I consider myself primarily a fiction writer. That's what I do. So the Moth is great because I don't have to don't have to lie, as it were. I don't have to create details. I just have to use my own life. I know the line is fuzzy sometimes with oral storytelling. People, I sometimes wonder about details, but I try not to. I compress time and stuff, and I do. I could change names to protect the innocent, but that's the other balm of the Moth, is that you don't have to make anything up. All the material's there, ready made. It's just a matter of shaping it into something that's going to translate to the stage. So yeah, it's a great relief not only to break out of your isolation, but to tell a true story as opposed to making something up.
You mentioned earlier about this being on the stage is kind of being a part of this larger community and like breaks you out of that isolation. And I think that's real important to hit on that really if anyone's ever going to sort of quote unquote make it in any art form, it's really important to be a member of something larger than your own little bubble. And how important is that for you to get you to be more, to put a public face on it and be a part of something greater than just your own work?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. In fact, tonight, I've been out of town for a while, and tonight I'm going to go hang out with two buddies who I never would have met if it wasn't for the Moth, and who both have amazing stories in their own right that they're in the process of telling in various forms. But the minute you become part of the Moth group, or not just the Moth, but the storytelling scene, yeah, you jump outside of yourself because you're also listening. That's the other component. I mean, you tell your story for 10 minutes, but then you sit there and listen to another 45 minutes of stories that aren't your own. And there are amazing people who tell stories at the Moth. There are astronauts and cops. There's a guy named Steve Osborne who told stories with the Moth in the early days, who's a former New York police officer and just has amazing, funny tales. Lots of my friends have come from the storytelling community, and it's just wonderful. It is wonderful to be to be something bigger than yourself. And it should be said, I guess, that it's also, there's nothing really at stake except bragging rights with the storytelling community. I mean, no one's getting rich off of this. You're not going to get a book contract necessarily. You're just up there sharing stories, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful feeling. It's not the same. I have friends who do stand-up comedy, and stand-up comedy notoriously is very, it's a lot more brutal and cutthroat. Not so with storytelling. There's obviously something very different about it. I mean, there are, of course, when you're in New York City, people will always make it competitive and nasty, but to me, I've gotten great friendships.
When you were at Avenues, how did you develop the hip high intensity practice? Define that for people who might not know what it's about. It's a piece that you wrote for Creative Nonfiction, the Writer at Work section. So how did you come to write this essay, but also the that particular
process?
Practice? Yeah.
Well, it should be said that I did not create hip. I don't know. I'm sorry. That didn't come across, but my supervisor, the man who hired me, Todd Shy, who was the man who developed this method of teaching young people. I was merely, I came in along with two other staff members, and there were two other people. So it was a total of 5 of us. We were a team, and our job was to just make sure that we kept it going, and that the school could see that it was something that the students were benefiting from. So it was, and we looked, I think, in definitely for the article, I made sure I tried to see if there was something else like it in the country. And my boss, Todd, wasn't aware of it. He had developed it on his own. He was a writer himself and thought that it was just, with no grades, no homework, just come in and have the students play. So he really needs to be given the credit for development. Although the team that we had, we came up with prompts. We had to come up with new prompts for a whole year worth of work. So that in itself was a challenge, but that was also tremendous fun just to come up with stuff, test prompts out that students would react to. So HIP, I mean, Todd's whole imperative with HIP, and I believe I said this in the article, was to cultivate empathy, flexibility, cognitive, thinking. So students could make these sudden leaps and write from the point of view of their cell phone, for instance, give them permission to do something that crazy, or write from the point of view of their least favorite relative on the holidays. Just try and get them thinking, to use a cliche, thinking outside the box, but also to do it in 20 minutes. Right. Don't think, just do it. Come in. So teaching was kind of a misnomer. Like when you're teaching HIP, you don't really teach per se in the traditional sense. Like you really students had notebooks that they would have for the whole year. We would come, and you only had 45 minutes or so, which is quite a challenge to settle people down. But once they got the prompt, you brought them in, sat them down, maybe did 10 minutes of prep, but then said, okay, write from the point of view of a stone on the beach, or, write about, you give them the prompt and they would just write for 20, 25 minutes. And then we'd go around and read first lines, see if people generally love doing that. And then I'd read the notebooks that day. And then the following class, I would select one or two students to read aloud if their essay was particularly good. So that's basically the format. Does that make sense? Is that clear?
Yeah. What's great about it, it's kind of like we were talking about earlier with Debusse's 17 minutes in his truck. And it also talks about or alludes to this Parkinson's law, I think it is, like the task will swell to fill the time you give it. So like even if you gave them 3 hours, they might not get as much work done in 3 hours as they do in 20 minutes. So like when you set the egg timer for 20 minutes, it's kind of amazing how much work you can get done in a short amount of time if you just really drill down.
Yeah. And that's how I've basically, I think anyone who writes in the modern age has, when you have a schedule and you have a set amount of time to write, that you have no choice, but you have to write. You only have 17 minutes near a graveyard. You've only got 20 minutes or an hour. Sometimes that's better than having all the free time in the world. If you have too much time, sometimes you get lax about it. So if you have a focused period of time with which to do your work, it's amazing what comes out, because then you're really harnessing the subconscious, which is where all the good stuff is anyway. So that's what we're teaching these kids, basically. We didn't tell them that, but that's what we were basically teaching them, to harness their deep, deep subconscious. And they would have that experience of not remembering why they wrote something, which was really fun.
Yeah. And you also allude to the writing lab that you took while you were in high school with Wally Lamb, before he blew up into a best-selling author. What was that experience like? Yeah, that was pretty seminal. That was freshman year of high school, and this was right before he published his first novel. He had a writing lab, and it was literally just a room with computers and typewriters and Apple II GSs, where students would literally just do exactly what we're doing in HIP, just come in and play with writing. No grades that I remember. I'm pretty sure there were no grades. It was just a place. It was kind of an adjunct to the English classes. Far more fun, though. And he would allow us to just play with words, fiction and nonfiction. But the crucial moment that I always remember from that experience was I don't know if I said this in the piece, but he read a piece of mine out loud. And it wasn't that it was my piece per se, but just that I had never heard a piece read out loud. He read everyone's work out loud. But when he took my words and read them out loud, and watching people react, it was kind of like a prototype for what the Moth did. I mean, he treated them with respect and reverence. He wasn't grading them. He wasn't critiquing them. He would just say, listen to this. Listen to how this sounds. What do you think? And it was
phenomenal. That moment stayed with me all throughout my writing, has stayed with me all throughout my writing career. He was still is a very generous man, very generous, very humble, and very just a wonderful guy, very, very honest. And yeah, he's and I can't imagine my high school. That was the best part of high school.
Mm-hmm.
High school is traumatic enough, but his writing lab was, that and cross country running were the only things that got me through high school. They were just these phenomenal places where you felt safe. You felt like you could, you weren't going to be punished for having the wrong grades or saying the wrong thing. So yeah, I'm so happy. So then he published he published the book, or he got the contract. I think by the time we were seniors, he had the book had come out. So he gave the graduation speech, and it was wonderful to see him. He was a model too for what persistence of writing, because he'd been working on that book for 8 years or so. It was kind of this mythology that traveled among the faculty. Like, people knew that Wally was writing a book.
Yeah. What book was that? What was his debut?
She's Come Undone.
Okay.
Was his first book. And it got published, and then it came out. And then I think a year later, Oprah picked it for her book club. And that's really what kind of put him over the top, was that she picked it. And he suddenly overnight was being read by millions of people. So it was wonderful to see, because this, you saw that it could happen. Like, somebody could be laboring for years and on something mysterious called a novel, and then all of a sudden everyone was going to read it. So it was really quite nice to see that early example, because up until then writing had been pretty abstract. I'd read books, but I'd never actually met an author, someone who actually did it.
Yeah, it's like something, or someone gets anointed. It's something that other people do, and then to see it so close to home from someone that you knew personally, it kind of like, I don't know, it almost granted you a greater sense of permission to pursue it, because you can almost reach out and touch it, if that makes any sense.
No, it absolutely did. And to know not only that, but to know that he'd been doing it for a while without any kind of material gain. It was just something he needed to do, and he stayed true to it. I can't imagine. He had a family, and he was teaching high school, for God's sake. So I can't imagine his time was that he had a lot of time. So, but he did it, and when I published my first short story, I wrote him a note and basically just gushed and said, you're one of the reasons I've kept writing. And he just wrote back a wonderful letter and wrote, persistence. He just remember persistence. You're going to go up and down. There's going to be a lot of hills and valleys. Enjoy the ride, but just remember, persistence counts for a lot. And that too has stayed with me, because it's absolutely true.
Oh man, persistence is truly 90% of the game. I mean, it will beat, in the long game. It'll beat talent. It's that God-given talent. But yeah, there has to be the kernel of talent. But geez, without endurance and persistence, because it's a bloodbath.
It is a blood, and now more than ever, because there's so many more people making noise, so you have to break through that somehow. But then again, it's like, you just have to go all the way. As Charles Bukowski has a poem, I think, where he says, go all the way, no matter what. So it's, I'm sure you've experienced that. You just have to get up every day and do it. Persistent.
Yeah. I mean, it took me 10 years of submitting essays to creative nonfiction before I landed an essay in there. It's one. What
was your first piece?
It was just a couple issues ago. It was The Gentleman's Guide to Arousal-Free Slow Dancing.
That's a great title.
Yeah, it was about my thank you. It was about my middle school dinner dance, and how it was like everyone's first sort of a semi-formal dance, and everyone's apprehension was just springing wood on the dance floor. So that
Wow. Yeah.
so
No, that sounds familiar.
yeah, exactly. So that was it's that was it was for the joy themed issue, and so it was
Oh,
just like
excellent.
about just my wonderful experience of having conquered my apprehension, but also got to dance with the girl that I wanted to dance with all
Dance
year.
with.
Yeah.
That's phenomenal. I'll have to check. Are you, do you consider yourself primarily a nonfiction writer?
Yeah,
Yeah.
almost exclusively. But
Hmm.
I noodle around with fiction because just for my own fun, because I find that writing, or at least practicing fiction, I start to think like, oh, how can I sort of elicit this little imaginative thing in the real and make it verifiably true? Like what kind of questions can I be asking my willing characters to elicit that kind of mood that I could just dream up? So
Right.
it kind of like helps open up my interviewing and my question asking and my observational sort of toolbox to
It,
yeah.
yeah. It's really wonderful, isn't it? How these different muscles like help with the other muscles. It just everything you do with fiction can help with nonfiction and vice versa.
Yeah, I do find that noodling around with fiction, like when I'm writing with a pencil and a notebook for that, I tend to get more lost in that. Like time does really kind of stand still for that. I
Yeah.
have a little more fun with that, and before I know it, like an hour's gone by, and I didn't even know it, and my pencil is down to a nub. I was like, oh wow,
Wow.
that happened. So,
You were in the zone. That's what happens. Like it's a
yeah.
wonderful feeling. Yeah.
So what are some like maybe like 3 to 5 books that were really influential for you, or books that you love you reread over and over again, or give to people? Like really influential books,
Well,
novels or nonfiction, whatever that may be.
I've got a couple. One of the most influential. I'm a huge fantasy buff. I dream about writing a fantasy because it's so difficult to write. But as a kid growing up, I read Tolkien, of course. But one of the most influential authors that I've ever read would be Ursula K. Le Guin, who is, I think, a part of, yeah, I think she lives in Oregon, I believe, right? She
Yeah.
lives in Portland. So she is, I read the Earthsea books, and I've read everything she's written, but the Earthsea books in particular, to me, are phenomenal examples of books that they marry literary ambitions, quote unquote, with genre writing, for lack of a better word. I mean, she's been for years. She was placed like in the what they call the genre ghetto, which is this unfair realm where they put people who write about dragons
Hmm.
and beasts. But now I think that those walls have started to crumble. And to me, it's like the writer I've been waiting for. She writes about peace, and she has ideas, and her books are so succinct. I mean, fantasy books, she doesn't write like Game of Thrones size doorstops. Like she just
Hmm.
writes these really 200-page brilliant novels that encompass so many ideas in a fantasy realm. And it's just I just always refer her. For people who don't like fantasy, I always refer Ursula K. Le Guin, because she's a lot of fun and yet just brilliant, absolutely brilliant way to dramatize ideas subversively, like in a way that's, so I mean, I've given her books to a lot of people, and I've yet to have anyone come back and say she's awful.
Yeah.
Earthsea is, I don't know if you've read them, but they're charming. They're just absolutely charm on impact, I find.
And what other books do you find yourself rereading?
I have one of the books. I'm actually looking right at it. Are you familiar with Lewis Hyde?
No.
Familiar with him? Oh, if you write nonfiction, I discovered him a few years back. He is phenomenal. He writes, his most famous book is called The Gift, which you may have seen around. But the book that I read, he's got a book called Trickster Makes the World. Trickster Makes This World. And it's all about the trickster motif, mischief, myth, and art. And he goes through a lot of cultural traditions and into the modern world, and he talks about the trickster ideal. Like he talks about Coyote and Raven, and then he talks about, of all people, he talks about Allen Ginsberg and Frederick Douglass and Picasso, and how they just upended the apple cart with their work. It's a book that I highly recommend it for anyone. David Foster Wallace called him one of the true superstars of nonfiction, and he makes connections the way that Joseph Campbell made connections back in the 70s with The Hero of a Thousand Faces, like just traces traditions throughout various cultures and makes them alive for the modern reader. So yeah, he's got a book. So that's my favorite book of his that I always give to people. But The Gift is called The Gift: Imagination and the Erotic Life of Property. And his most recent book, I think, was one about the commons. Common as Air, I think, is the name of it, about our our shared commons that we have artistically and politically. So in terms of nonfiction, he's the one I keep by my bedside, as well as a book called Silences by Tilly Olson, which I just recently discovered. And that's a harrowing book. I keep it by my bedside as a reminder. Tilly Olson was a Depression-era housewife. She had to drop out of high school to support her family during the Depression. So she talks about silences, the way that working class or women or people of color were often in the early, very much, and still not given as many opportunities to write. We take it for granted that we have time to write, but she outlines various ways that a lot of voices were silenced just because of domestic duties. And so I keep that book by my bedside to remind myself how much times have changed, but also just how lucky I am to be able to do this.
How do you build into your life time and activities that help restore or refill your creative barrel?
How do I what do I do? Occasionally, yeah.
Yeah, like if you're feeling a bit, just sort of just dry and spent, and it becomes a little too laborious to write anything, or it just feels like what do you do to recharge, I guess?
Physical activity.
Yeah.
getting off my butt and doing something physical and not thinking about writing at all. So going on a hike, last week I was in the mountains, hiking in the White Mountains in New Hampshire. That never fails to restore me. I practice Shaolin Kung Fu here in the city, and that you will not think about writing at all when you're practicing a martial arts, when the master's there telling you to get your form together. So I do physical activity. It keeps me in shape. I think I read somewhere early on in my career, I read an article that said, as a writer, you're obviously not going to have health care, so you better keep yourself healthy and stay in shape. And I thought, wow, that's amazingly practical advice I do. I go for a run, I go for a hike in the woods, and that always never fails to, once I leave my desk, I can always feel my mind because if you stay at your desk too long, you calcify. So yeah, physical activity, get up and move.
And what are some other artistic media that you like to consume, like other than writing or reading, that helps inform the work you do?
Well, I think, like a lot of people, I think I love the direction that narrative television has taken. It doesn't, in terms of getting out of your head, like, it's just wonderful to watch something develop episodically over a period of time. So obviously I do watch a bit of television, but I also love, I love going to a talk, listening to somebody else, like a scholar. If someone's giving a talk, I listen to, there's tons of stuff to choose from, or go to a gallery in the city. But something, anything to get me outside of my own head. But listen to music. Obviously that music is huge I listen to Leonard Cohen a lot. So anything to snap me out of my narcissistic mindset, get me out of my head. But music is a big one. I mean, music is really, I do music and house chores. That's when I do I clean the dishes or whatever I have to do. I put in a podcast or I put in an album, and I'm happy. And and I listen to somebody else's poetry. It's always a good thing.
If you had to, if there's someone who's a teenager, early 20s, mid 20s, and from your vantage point, and if they were looking for a little bit of guidance or advice, and they want to achieve that high level of visibility that we all want with our work, like what are some things you might tell him or her about deconstructing their apex goal and what
their ambition?
Yeah, and deconstructing that, and how might you practically tell them to go about that?
So you mean like to become a writer, or to literally become visible in the media?
Oh,
landscape?
I guess. Well, to become visible as a writer. Yeah, like if they wanted to, say, perform on the Moth stage or write for the New Yorker, like something really big, but then it's really too big to look at once. But if you start breaking down and digesting the steps, there can be a logical progression.
Well, I always, when I used to teach creative writing classes, fiction classes at Hunter, and I would get this question. My students would ask me like what they could do, and I always say, well, the first thing you need to do is live. You need to get out there and live, which sounds very abstract, but I wouldn't have any stories to tell at the Moth if I didn't grab life, firmly and do, and it becomes a cliche, but I always say to young people, before you become committed or tied down to a job or a relationship that you don't want to let go of, like just, do something wild and crazy. You don't have to travel the world. When I was young, I thought I had to be Jack London or Jack Kerouac. And so I would set out doing dangerous things like hitchhiking. You don't have to do things like that. But I mean, you have to really live a life in order to tell stories. So you really need to do things. You need to not think so much about your visibility so much as your who you are. You really, which again sounds really abstract and it's hard to define. I mean, anyone can put up a website and promote yourself, but you have to have something that's worth writing about. And the only way to do that is if you live an honest and true existence, if you're doing what you want to do in your waking life, so you're, that's really what I tell them, is that you just have to live. You really just have to live and do things besides writing. There's a great story by Lori Moore on how to be a writer. And I think the first sentence is first try to be something else, anything else, an astronaut or something, it's this really funny opening line. And I tell them that too. I was like, don't, if you feel more drawn towards, because some people feel they have this crazy feeling that they have to be a writer, but it makes them unhappy to do it. And there's a difference between that and, those of us who keep pummeling away, you're not always happy, but ultimately if you're not happy, which again would seem obvious, but I encountered so many students who were doing it and they were miserable and they were much better. They had much more fun playing music or something like that. And I said, well, you don't have to write. So ironically enough, sometimes the advice is to, when you're young, you have all these ideas in your 20s about who you have to be. And so, but again, when I was in my 20s, I don't know that I had an image of what a writer looked like. I just knew that I had to live. I had to collect stories. I had to go out and get hurt.
Yeah.
Get my heart broken a few times before I could even imagine to have something worth writing about. So if that makes any sense, I don't know. That's kind of abstract answer.
So what still excites you about the storytelling, whether it be spoken or the written word? What still brings you back to it over and over again?
So there's all this like hysteria about, the print media going away, and you'd think this would be the last profession on earth that anyone would get into. But what keeps me coming back is that incessant need we have for storytelling. Again, it sounds like a cliche to say that, but it is people, the need to have some kind of a narrative, the need to listen to something. Podcasts, which as I'm sure you know, are huge, like the podcast boom. And I think the storytelling, the fictional podcasts that are being produced we're just barely scratching the surface of what the medium can do. So that gets me excited, like what's happening in the podcast realm. But also just with a lot of small presses that are doing great work. So reading all the reading I do gets me excited and brings me back. And every time someone talks about so maybe I'm living in a bubble, I don't know, but I suspect not, because we still have this insane desire for, not insane, but this incessant need for narrative, the way our brains are wired. So that I do, that keeps me going.
Well, friends, we've made it through another glorious episode of the Creative Nonfiction Podcast. Thanks again to Hippocampus Magazine for promotional support. Be sure to check out the wonderful work Donna Tallarico and her team are doing over there. Also, Donna Tallarico, she was on the podcast, episode 65. Check that out. Again, I ask that you share this and any episode of the podcast on your social feeds. Leave a nice short review on iTunes and subscribe to my monthly newsletter. You get my book list and podcast news for the month. Once a month, no spam. Gotta dig it. If you hurry, you'll get the next one on October 1st. And may the riff be with you.